Hello viewers and welcome back to Sunny's Broadcasts. Today I am going to be talking about the regressive left, history, theory, and methodology. Part 2, Senseless Social Justice. The migrant rate crisis in Europe coincides with the emergence of the term social justice warrior as a pejorative rather than a complimentary term, especially following the infamous Gamergate controversy. Compare with political correctness in the 1990s. Both political correctness and social justice warrior denote a dogmatism and authoritarian identity politics, and both are used interchangeably by the right wing as snarl terms with which to attack all liberal and leftist thought. Regressive leftism and the SJWs are now a major internet phenomena, with news, blogs, and pundits both for and against being major sources of controversy and thus big business, especially in ad revenue-generated clickbait social media outlets. The problem is especially bad on college campuses, as the February 2nd, 2017 UC Berkeley riots so recently brought to the attention of so many. The present form of SJW leftism seemed to kick into high gear during the Obama years, especially at the high watermark of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Beneath the veneer of what came across as a radical protest against the entrenchment of corporate power in American politics were deep strains of identitarian regressivism. Some of it were cultural dysfunctions that have plagued American radicalism throughout its entire history, a preoccupation with direct democracy and mass consensus decision-making, resulting in movement paralysis. But alongside this was a kind of SJW operational prototype called the progressive stack, wherein preference at meetings was given to members of marginalized groups over the privileged. White males spoke last at meetings, if at all. Accompanying this were the now familiar accoutrements of the feminization of radicalism, anti-heterosexuality, and the insistence upon white and or male-free spaces and ideas being at the heart of the movement. The only way to end the dominance of one group, it would seem, would be the imposition of the dominance of another. All of this has had the effect of creating a huge space on the political right to capitalize on popular anxieties over Muslim immigration, frustration with frivolous social justice activism, and the dictatorial political correctness underlying it all, that the progressives themselves refuse to acknowledge. The results have no doubt contributed greatly to the rise of populist nationalism, the kind exemplified by Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, and Donald Trump across Europe and the English-speaking world. Donald Trump's electoral victory stunned a world that had written him off as an unqualified racist and misogynistic curmudgeon. In retrospect, it is easy to see how his win is a vote of no confidence against both a GOP establishment that has had no new ideas since Reagan, and a hopelessly compromised DNC establishment that stacked the deck against Bernie Sanders in favor of Hillary Clinton, a corporatist hawk with a lengthy record of voting with the Bush administration behind a very thin veneer of girl power. None of this has taught the DNC much-needed lessons about the dangers of ignoring public concerns in favor of doubling down on the narratives dominant in their own mainstream media echo chambers. The sudden emergence of the identity-obsessed social justice warrior in tandem with the Occupy movement does give one pause. We also know through WikiLeaks that a well-funded and concerted effort to create a liberal echo chamber began in the 2007-2008 period. But this echo chamber was built upon a firmly established foundation. Regressive leftism predates America's first black president. In his 2007 book, What's Left, British leftist Nick Cohen attacks what he perceives as a knee-jerk anti-Western tendency in the English-speaking world, which causes them to cherry-pick the human rights causes that galvanize them and find common cause with authoritarian governments and regimes abroad. Center-left parties in the Western world gradually built electoral coalitions around the demographic changes that have been occurring since the 1970s. Both mass immigration and political correctness are key components of this coalition. It was a politically sensible move back in the 1980s and 90s when socialism fell out of favor and the clout of organized labor declined due to outsourcing, automation, and a more conservative political climate. But as Sam Harris enunciates here, this coalition is becoming toxic for the center-left.
I share the view that the election was generally a repudiation of the left, and of political correctness in particular, as much as it was just a vote for change. It was a repudiation of black and brown identity politics by white identity politics. And it's important to point out that this isn't the same as racism. Okay, I don't believe that a majority of the people who voted for Trump were motivated by racism. There are people who voted for Obama twice who voted for Trump. Racism cannot be the best way to explain that. And this is where the prevailing analysis on the left is wrong, of the sort that I just read from David Remnick in The New Yorker. Yes, we have just elected a man who was officially endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. So you can be sure that every white racist in the country voted for Trump. But there are millions of other decent people who have reasonable concerns about a movement like Black Lives Matter. And most of these people probably voted for Trump too. These people are not racists. They were simply recoiling from charges of racism and from a toxic brand of identity politics. Much of what has been coming out of the left, not everything, but much of it, particularly about race and about law and order and about Islamophobia and terrorism, about issues that are fundamental to the security of our society, has had all the moral clarity and intellectual honesty of the O.J. verdict, which is to say none at all. And I'm confident that many people who don't perceive Trump to be a dangerous con man in the way that I do probably voted for him out of sheer exasperation. They were sick of being called racist for not worrying about Halloween costumes on our Ivy League campuses. So millions of these people, along with real racists, told all you whinging social justice warriors at Yale and Brown to go fuck yourselves. And can you really blame them? I mean, safe spaces, trigger warnings, new gender pronouns, getting Muslim student groups to deplatform speakers like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Bill Maher. Was that the cause of your generation? That's the trench you were willing to die in?
Accusations of racism as a means of stifling debate and smearing opponents have worn thin on once sympathetic populations. On the subject of Sam Harris, it would seem at first glance that the so-called new atheist writers of the early 21st century, besides Sam Harris there were Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, among others, who do not seem to typify regressive leftism. Most of these figures are not that left-wing, for one thing, and for another, their criticisms of the dogmatism and irrationality of religious belief were in direct keeping with the humanist tradition of liberals such as Bertrand Russell and others like him. It was these authors who first informed the online skeptic community that are among today's staunchest critics of regressive leftism. However, the new atheists did set many precedents that helped legitimize the current wave of regressiveness. Some of this was inadvertent. The doctrine of original sin both created and legitimized internalized guilt and inferiority complexes, which subsequently sought out other forms of expression after Christian theology had been thoroughly deconstructed. White male guilt, by now long institutionalized in many branches of social sciences and academia, for reasons soon to be expounded upon, stepped in to fill this psychological void. In even deeply personal affairs, this dynamic proved useful to certain types of people. Radical feminism, in the manner of Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, made it acceptable to think that sex is dirty again. Notice that regressive leftism was not nearly as successful in regions such as the United States South, where the Southern Baptist Convention did not liberalize to nearly the degree that mainline Protestant denominations did. The new atheism also galvanized the current crop of SJWs more directly, when they made the treatment of women, racial minorities, and LGBT people a part of their overall critique of religious belief. Moreover, I think the new atheism went beyond politics or even relationships between people in their critiques, but also politicized people's most deeply held views and beliefs. While lip service was paid to freedom of conscience, as far as the online League of the Militant Godless was concerned, one was on the side of wrong, backwardness, and oppression merely for having the wrong beliefs. Oftentimes, merely believing in the Christian God was equated to being a racist or fascist sympathizer. None of this is to say that critique of religious doctrine is in and of itself inherently regressive, nor did the early 21st century crop of atheist authors pioneer ideological policing in liberal quarters, but stating or at least implying that one is stupid or morally wrong for holding the incorrect beliefs both sets and follows dangerous precedents, even if sometimes warranted. This is especially so when there is, as there frequently was in online flame wars between Christians and atheists, a strong undertone of classist elitism, with religiosity, together with racism, misogyny, and homophobia, being associated with being poor, uneducated, or being a redneck. While many of Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchinson's critiques of the Christian doctrine were fair and accurate, liberal stances in the culture wars were accompanied, perhaps unwittingly, by a growing tendency to stand above rather than beside the poor and marginalized, so long as the poor and marginalized were white, mind you. Plus, prior to the very recent emergence of controversies surrounding regressive left coddling of Islamism and the whole SJW phenomenon, itself in part due to the schism within the skeptic community over its alleged sexism, the new atheists were extremely sensitive to any suggestion that repression and dogmatism could come from atheists or come from the left. But, as we shall see when exploring the history of Russia and China in the 20th century, it can and does. Controversies surrounding dogmatism and censorship on Western college campuses predate the presidency of George W. Bush. Shock pundits such as Milo Yiannopoulos were not the first to call our attention to fanatical and dogmatic enclaves of left-wing ideologues on college campuses. During the Clinton years, and even during the presidency of George W. Bush's father, concerns of political correctness were raised by authors such as Alan Bloom, Dinesh D'Souza, and Christina Hoff Sommers, not to mention George H.W. Bush himself. The ideological foundations of the present SJW movement had been long in the process of being laid even then. Concern was raised not merely regarding the radical nature of the ideas being taught in Black Studies or Women's Studies departments, but with the the impact leftist movements were having on campuses. Concerns that a Western conservatism built entirely on anti-communism, and then at the peak of its power and influence were willing, for the most part, to ignore in the days following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the USSR. This will be continued in Part 3, Academic Anarchy. These have been Cine's Broadcasts. Over and out.